Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we begin journal collection number 58, dating from the year 1867, when the author was 64 years old. With that said, I will read the editorial biographical update. The winter brought its usual task, and Mr. Emerson went westward in January, lecturing in 9 states, and not returning home until after the middle of March. He visited Kansas for the first time, and took great pleasure in Minnesota. From Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, he wrote to a friend in Chicago, "Such a citizen of the world as you are should look once at these northern towns, which I have seen under the perhaps too smiling face of the mildest, best winter weather. Minneapolis would strongly attract me if I were a young man, more than St. Paul. And this town, Fond du Lac, is a wonderful growth and shines like a dream, seen this morning from the top of Amory Hall." At the time of the celebration of the centenary anniversary of Emerson's birth, Mr. B. J. Brown wrote in the Daily Leader of Menominee, Wisconsin, reminiscences of Mr. Emerson's visit to Saginaw, Michigan. As president of the Library Association, Mr. Brown called upon Mr. Emerson at the hotel. He wrote, "The enduring impression of greatness, majesty, and power which this interview with him left upon me was something akin to that which I experienced upon the first glimpse of the ocean. The tones of his voice long lingered in my ear." Mr. Brown told Mr. Emerson of the new railroad that was to be, though the work had hardly begun, from Lake Superior to Puget Sound. Emerson felt the greatest interest in the project, and needed slight sympathy and appreciation to kindle into speech the thoughts which at the moment evidently engrossed him. It strongly appealed to his imagination and his feelings, and nothing in his lecture on the following evening approached the lofty and sustained eloquence in which he clothed the subject. At some time during the day he told me of an opinion he had once heard Chief Justice Shaw deliver upon a question connecting itself with the law of highways, and how admirable it had seemed to him. Professedly seeking to relate simply what the great Chief Justice had said, he so transmuted it in the alembic of his own imagination as to invest the subject of the common roads of the country with a dignity which linked it to the movement of the tides and the planets in their courses. End note. Washington, Iowa, February 13, 1867. In riding in an open sleigh from Oshkosh to Ripon, in a fiercely cold snowstorm driving in my face, I blessed the speed and power of the horses. Their endurance makes them inestimable in this rough country. They seem left out of doors in the snow and wind all day. Around this square before the house, I counted just now 20 horses tied. Some of them seemed to stand tied all day. Last night, just before going to bed, I looked out. There stood 2 or 3 at that hour, the farmer perhaps listening to the railroad men in the courthouse, or sitting round the barroom fire. Mrs. Carr gave me a speech of Red Jacket that compares with my old one from him about time. When the young men were boasting of their deeds, he said, "But the 60s have all the 20s and 40s in them." As soon as these people have got a shanty built to cover them, and have raised one crop of wheat, they want a railroad as the breath of life, and after one railroad, then a competing railroad. The first, because a railroad station is an instant market for the wheat. A second, because the first charges its own rates for freight, which takes half the price out of the crop, or as much money to get it from their farm to Chicago as it costs to get it from Chicago to New York. And the second road underbids the first, and every new road underbids that, so that a web of roads has the like effect as the first creation of railways produced on the factories, which formerly turned out their new stocks only in spring and autumn, when the traders came to New York and Boston for their semi-annual supply. But the new roads enabled them to come often, and therefore the factories could sell and the traders buy all the year round, so that it required less capital to be a country trader. Now a market at each station makes a small New York near to every farm. Then, socially, in spring and in much of winter, the people of Indiana, Illinois, etc., are confined to their sidewalks or the rail. Off these they stick at once in bottomless universal quagmire, and as here and now in a thaw, the melting snow makes a river of each run. In the vast level the poor water does not know where to go, and drowns, as yesterday here, a fine span of horses, because a boy in crossing a brook caught his wheel on a stone, and only saved his own life by climbing from his wagon onto a tree. Mr. Brown of Saginaw tells me that men that live by their own labor are almost always moral people. Thomas Taylor and Winckelmann would have preferred to all meeting houses and churches to have restored the old native service of the temples on whose ruin these had been constructed, and to have worshipped with Horace for the psalm book, chanting Mercury fecunda nepus Atlantis, or Sic te diva potens Cypri, with tibia and theorbus and lyre to all the psalters and all the organs of the Romish or the English congregations. Eloquence. But what astonishes, what surprises you? To hear an Athenian talk 2 hours together, hold us silent and immovable as the figures of Hermes before our doors, and find not a single one among us that can carry home with him a thought or an expression. Landor, Works, Volume 1, page 88. This passage reminds me of my own experience in hearing in old times Jonathan Phillips's speech at a Unitarian meeting in Dr. Channing's church. Christ preached the greatness of man. We preach the greatness of Christ. The first is affirmative, the last negative. We measure religions by their civilizing power. Christianity gains and thrives against worldly interests. So does Buddhism, Stoicism, and every high enthusiasm. The mind is true. Though the premises are false, the conclusions are right. And this self-reliance which belongs to every healthy human being is proof of it. Proof that not a petty egoism but the soul of the world is in him, and in proportion as it penetrates his miserable crust of partiality, it saith, Here am I, here is the whole. Therefore we require absoluteness in every soul, absoluteness in the orator, in the poet, in the hero, in all manners, and if they have it not, they simulate it. The pride of a man consists herein that the recognition of him by others is nowise necessary to him. Those persons who constitute the natural aristocracy, in other words, sacred persons, are not found in the actual aristocracy or only on its edge, as the chemical energy of the spectrum is found to be the greatest just outside the spectrum. The intellectual power is not the gift, but the presence of God. Nor do we reason to the being of God, but God goes with us into nature, when we go or think at all. Truth is always new and wild as the wild air, and is alive. Quote, This world is no place for the man who doth not worship, and where, O Arjun, is there another? Bhagavad Gita. When we come into the world, a wonderful whisper gives us a direction for the whole road, much as if one should hear from a skillful guide, one starting out on a journey, that to come at the point he sought, he should follow the setting sun. This whisper wonderfully impresses us, and is temperament, taste, bearing, talent. 'Tis like the card of the compass, which arranges itself for the poles of the world. But having made and molded the constitution, the Creator contents himself, and is never dumb. He that made the world lets that speak, and does not employ a town crier, etc., etc. After much experience, we find literature the best thing, and men of thought, if still thinking, the best company. I went to England, and after allowing myself freely to be dazzled by the various brilliancy of men of talent, in calm hours I found myself no way helped. My sequins were all yellow leaves. I said, I have valued days, and must still, by the number of clear insights I get, and I must estimate my company so. Then I found I had scarcely had a good conversation, a solid dealing man in England. Only in such passages is a reason for human life given, and every such meeting puts a mortal affront on kings and governments by showing them to be of no account. Of course, these people, these and no others, interest us, the dear and beautiful beings who are absorbed in their own dream. Let us then have that told. Let us have a record of friendship among 6 or 4 or 2, if there only be 2 of those who delight in each other, only because both delight in the eternal laws, who forgive nothing to each other, who by their joy and homage to these laws are made incapable of conceit, which destroys the fine wits. Any other affection between men than this geometric one of relation to the same thing is a mere mush of materialism. And the Spirit drove him apart into a solitary place. This does the Spirit for every man. He or that which in despair of naming aright, some have called the newness, as the Hebrews did not like to pronounce the word. He lurks, he hides, he who is success, reality, joy, power. That which constitutes heaven, which reconciles impossibilities, atones for shortcomings, expiates sins or makes them virtues, buries in oblivion the crowded historical past, sinks religions, philosophies, nations, persons to legends, reverses the scale of opinion, of fame, reduces science to opinion, and makes the thought of the moment the key to the universe and the egg of history to come. 'Tis all alike, astronomy, metaphysics, sword, spade, pencil, or instruments and arts yet to be invented. This is the inventor, the worth-giver, the worth. This is he that shall come, or if he come not, nothing comes. He that disappears in the moment when we go to celebrate him. If we go to burn those that blame our celebration, he appears in them. The divine newness, hoe and spade, sword and pen, cities, pictures, gardens, laws, Bibles, are prized only because they are means he sometimes used. So with astronomy, music, arithmetic, castes, feudalism. We kiss with devotion these hems of his garment. We mistake them for him. They crumble to ashes on our lips. Every innovation grows out of a thought, which hastens to embody itself in practical rules. These rules require much controversy, sifting, and amendment to make them work well in practice, and the sentiment in which all agreed, the mother of all the rules, is soon overlaid and forgotten in the debate. But that also got expression at first. The rules become national and fill the world with noise, and the sentiment passes for rhetoric. That the rules are changed every year, grow aged very soon, whilst the sentiment is immortal and can at any time provide itself with new codes. Swedenborg was never quite ideal. The eye must be achromatic, but Swedenborg sees all amiss with his prismatic blur of misplaced gaudiness. Why do his images give no pleasure? Milton anticipated Swedenborg when he wrote in Paradise Lost, Book 5, "What if earth be but the shadow of heaven, and things therein, each to the other like, more than on earth is thought?" I am so purely a spectator that I have absolute confidence that all pure spectators will agree with me whenever I make a careful report. I told Alcott that every one of my expressions concerning God or the soul, etc., is entitled to attention as testimony, because it is independent, not calculated, not part of any system, but spontaneous, and the nearest word I could find to such the thing. Over the soul can and will God allow no one to rule but himself alone. Martin Luther. The moral sentiment is pure vision, and what is religion? Religion is the architecture of the sentiment. The sentiment never rests in vision, but wishes to be enacted. It does not pause. Man is architectural, always goes to precipitate the particles held in solution by his thought into a form, which obeys and represents the thought, aims always to turn his tent into a house, his camping ground into an estate, garden, and field. These lightning flashes of the divine soul into a good house lamp, or better, if he can, into an annual and perennial sun. I affirm that in all men is this majestic perception and command which we call moral sentiment. It is the truth itself. It is foolish cavil to say, "What? You will adore yourself?" I find that all men are perishing, frivolous ghosts before this dread imperturbability which dwells in the heart of every person. Don't be deceived by outsides. That is the stupendous mystery which we are always familiar, but passes all explanation, that in the rubbish of whims and appetites and sins of all these poor personalities resides at bottom this sublime universality. The soul, as it obeys the inward law, reveres it, comes to feel that the listening after any saint or prophet were an impiety against this immediate revelation. Morals. The moral sentiment, it is absolute and in every individual, the law of the world. It is found that the instinct of the brute creation has a certain faint coincidence with morals. The moral element is the reason of things applied to human action. We do not cite Archimedes to establish the equality of the radii of the circle, nor Pythagoras for the law of the hypotenuse, nor Newton for the laws of light, nor Rumford for those of heat, though these may first have announced certain propositions. Once announced, they are accepted by all and stand forevermore on the nature of things, though they were successively enunciated by these men. It had been vain to enunciate them if they had not been first true in the mind, and the true geometer passes over these perished announcers to the eternal virtue, of which they, as he, are the vehicles. So we do not attribute except in the pleasing acts of imagination authority to Moses, or to Jesus, or to other moralists, as soon as we have seen that their lessons are really true in nature. Then we lose the words and the saints and the riches of the soul from which he spoke, and which is perfect today. It is not to be disputed that every opinion, every motive, every idea plants itself in a man, who becomes its representative and name for his age or ages, as Solon or Lycurgus, as Homer, Euclid, Aristotle, as Jesus, as Mohammed, as Caesar, as Brutus, as Washington, as Calhoun. It is doubtful whether London, whether Paris can answer the questions which now rise in the mind. Then there's an untranslated quote from Saint Beuve. Nationality. We Americans have got suppled into the state of melioration. We have lived fast in 10 years, in 4 years last past. Things once not possible are probable now. Women dispose of their own property. Women will vote. Women lecture, preach, are physicians, artists. Stand where you are and make the best of it. I cannot find any bar in the way of social life here. I see, too, happy homes and true gentlemen to live and die for, and friends to die with. Nationality is often silly. Every nation believes that the divine providence has a sneaking kindness for it, as God has been received a burgher of Bern. America. I thought of Chapin's lecture, "It is not a question whether we shall be a nation or only a multitude of people, but whether we shall be the new nation, the leading guide and lawgiver of the world, as having clearly chosen and firmly held the simplest and best rule of political society. The office of America is to liberate, to abolish kingcraft, priestcraft, caste, monopoly, to pull down the gallows, to burn up the bloody statute book, to take in the immigrant, to open the doors of the sea and the fields of the earth, to extemporize government in Texas, in California, in Oregon, to make provisional law where statute law is not ready. This liberation appears in the power of invention, the freedom of thinking and readiness for reforms. The human race is immortal. Oppressed here, they step aside into taverns or solitudes and are free there. In the quiet of cottages or of friendship or of pothouses, they see the passing of so many gods. whether Jove or Hertha or Thor or Christ or Allah, which live longer or shorter terms and then die. But the good human race outlives them all, and forever in the heart abides the old sovereign, sentiment requiring justice and good will to all, and rebuilds the decayed temples, and with new names chants again the praise of eternal right. How shall it inaugurate its own ritual in the new age? It has the Sunday, which is the wisdom and necessity of mankind, for inspiration, for solitude, for society. The morale is the source of inspiration. It shall inspire whom it will to uplift and persuade men, will write hymns and meditations and histories that edify and provoke us. March. Lessing said of the astronomers, "It is easier for them to meet disaster than at sea, and they make glorious shipwreck who are lost in seeking worlds." Universities. The treatises that are written on university reform may be acute or not, but their chief value to the observer is the showing that a cleavage is occurring in the hitherto firm granite of the past, and a new era is nearly arrived. Books. The advantage of the old-fashioned folio was that it was safe from the borrowers. Gladly the boy learns that the 5 line in the multiplication table goes to the tune of Yankee Doodle. If a man happens to have a good father, he needs less history. He quotes his father on each occasion, his habits, manners, rules. If his father is dull and unmentionable, then his own reading becomes more important. Color. At Nantasket Beach, I cannot but approve the taste which clothe the emperors in purple when I see the wet porphyry pebbles. Culture is partial. I know so well that frequent unhappy figure with educated eyes and uneducated body. The good writer seems to be writing about himself, but has his eyes always on that thread of the universe which runs through himself and all things. The word miracle, as it is used, only indicates the savage ignorance of the devotee, staring with wonder to see water turned into wine, and heedless of the stupendous fact of himself being there present. If the water became wine, became fire, became a chorus of angels, it would not compare with the familiar fact of his own perception. Here he stands, a lonely thought, harmoniously organized into correspondence with the universe of mind and matter. April 10th. Yesterday at the funeral of George L. Stearns. Rode to Mount Auburn in a carriage with Mr. Alcott and Mr. P., and had long conversation on Swedenborg. Mr. P., intelligent and well versed on Swedenborg, but his intelligence stops as usual at the Hebrew symbolism. Philosopher up to that limit, but there accepts the village church as part of the sky. In a day not far off, this English obstinacy of patching the ecliptic of the universe with a small bit of tin will come to an end. Editor's note. On the 19th of April, Concord's proud day, of this year a granite obelisk was dedicated on the common in honor of the soldiers connected with the town who lost their lives in the recent war. Mr. Emerson made the address, which is printed in the miscellanies. End note. You complain that the Negroes are a base class. Who makes and keeps the Jew or the Negro base? Who but you who exclude them from the rights which others enjoy? If I were rich, I should get the education I have always wished by persuading Agassiz to let me carry him to Canada, and Dr. Gray to go to examine the trans-Mississippi flora, and Wyman should find me necessary to his excavations, and Alvin Clark should make a telescope for me too, and I can easily see how to find the gift for each master that would domesticate me with him for a time. I thought, as the train carried me so fast down the east bank of the Hudson River, that nature had marked the site of New York with such rare combination of advantages, as she now and then furnishes a man or woman to a perfection in all parts, and in all details, as if to know the luxuriant type of the race. finishing in one what is attempted or only begun in 1,000 individuals. The length and volume of the river, the gentle beauty of the banks, the country rising immediately behind the banks on either side, the noble outlines of the Catskills, the breadth of the bays at Croton and Tarrytown, then West Point, then as you approach New York, the sculptured Palisades, then at the city itself, the meeting of the waters, the river-like sound, and the ocean at once instead of the weary Chesapeake and Delaware bays. Mr. Justice Maule requested Sir Cresswell, then at the bar, to remember that his opponents were vertebrate animals, and that his manner to them would be offensive from God Almighty to a black beetle. Pall Mall Gazette. May 1st. Editor's Note. The new volume of poems, May Day, was just printed, and here in the journal is a list of 50 friends and relatives to whom Mr. Emerson sent it on May Day. On May 3rd, Mr. Emerson read The Rule of Life to the Radical Association in Boston, the substance of which was later incorporated in The Sovereignty of Ethics and The Preacher. End note. Nature sings. He lives not who can refuse me, all my force saith, come and use me. A May Day sun, a May Day rain, and all the zone is green again. Why is Collins's Ode to Evening so charming? It proves nothing, it affirms nothing, it has no thought, no fable, no moral. It is as if one's head, which was full of the sights and sounds of a summer evening, should listen to a few strains of an Aeolian harp, and find it restoring to him those sights and sounds. 'Tis good whistling. Editor's Note. On May 30th, Mr. Emerson made a short address at the meeting for the organization of the Free Religious Association in Boston. See Miscellanies, page 475. End note. Aunt Mary read Tasso in 1826. The story hurries her along, but she has too little imagination now to relish the inventions, and all the time thinks of Homer's Iliad. Alas, how narrow the limits of human invention! The Paradise Lost gains in the comparison, yet had that never been, were it not for these. The moderns write better, but the readers are too wise to enjoy as in an unphilosophical age. A few pulsations of created beings, a few successions of acts, a few lamps held out in the firmament, enables us to talk of time, make epochs, write histories, to do more, to date the revelations of God to man. But these lamps are held to measure out some of the moments of eternity, to divide the history of God's operations in the birth and death of nations, of worlds. It is a goodly name for our notions of breathing, suffering, enjoying, acting. We personify it. We call it by every name of fleeting, dreaming, vaporing imagery. Yet it is nothing. We exist in eternity, dissolve the body, and the night is gone. The stars are extinguished, and we measure duration by the number of our thoughts, by the activity of reason, the discovery of truths, the acquirement of virtue, the approach to God. Immortality. The longest life is but a morning, but where is the day? July 2nd. I happened today to fall upon a line in Aeschylus's 7 against Thebes, which says so long ago what Dr. Holmes talked of at the last club, the alleged standing up of the hare in terror. Then there's a quotation from it, untranslated, but it references that it is in line 564. In Old Boston, a feature not to be forgotten was John Wilson, the town crier who rung his bell at each street corner. Lost! A child strayed this morning from 49 Marlborough Street, 4 years old, had on check apron, etc. Auction! Battery March Square, etc., etc. He cried so loud that you could not hear what he said if you stood too near. Pindar, in the first Olympic ode, speaks with robust courage of a prize fighter of his own skill in verse, and as only Kepler and Shakespeare in the sonnets have done among the moderns. There is the like stoutness in his bust. Wordsworth, however, has shown a stout heart, and Lindor, but none compare with Kepler. Reading. I suppose every old scholar has had the experience of reading something in a book which was significant to him, but which he could never find again. Sure he is that he read it there, but no one else ever read it, nor can he find it again, though he buy the book and ransack every page. Classic. Mrs. Barbauld's Hymns for Children are also classics, as well as Pope and Dryden. Editor's note. On commencement day, Mr. Emerson was chosen an overseer of Harvard University, and on the following day, July 18th, for the second time after 30 years' interval, delivered the Phi Beta Kappa address. It is printed with some changes under the name The Progress of Culture in Letters and Social Aims. End note. The good augury of our larger dedication to natural science in this century is not so much for the added material power for which it is yielded, though that is conspicuous and we cannot have too much, as for the intellectual power it evokes, and shall I say the sublime delight with which the intellect contemplates each new analogy appearing between the laws of nature and its own law of life. Newton habitually regarded a particular fact in nature as a universal fact. What happens in one place at one time happens in all places at all times. Happens to see an apple fall, and says to himself, "What is the moon but a bigger apple falling also to the earth? What is the earth but a much bigger apple falling to the sun? I see the law of nature. Every atom falls to every atom." Then comes the farther thought, "Herein I am apprised that this universal material attraction is only a particular example of a more universal law. We will call it centrality, which holds for mind as well as matter." Identity and centrality, the one law for atom and sphere, for atom and universe, is indignantly denied by children, whether 2 years old or 100, and is affirmed by those whose eyes are opened. Every breath of air is the carrier of the universal mind. The child sees the single fact. The philosopher sees in it only the eternal identity. I cannot yet say accurately what is the analogon of each cosmical or chemical law. Swedenborg, or a possible Swedenborg, can. But I affirm with perfect security that such analogon for each material law observed exists in the spiritual nature, and that better than the satisfaction in arriving at the formula of the chemic law is the spasm, shall I say, of pleasure, which pervades the intellect in recognizing, however dimly, the instant perception of its equal holding through heaven as well as through earth. The laws below are sisters of the laws above. Medical use of friendship. Linnaeus cured his gout by wood strawberries, but when Calm returned from America, Linnaeus was laid up with severe gout. But the joy in his return and the curiosity to see his plants restored him instantly, and he found his old friend as good as the treatment by wood strawberries. When I see my friend, his eyes testify much more good than his speech, for he leaves me to learn from others the benefits he has just conferred. Great are the silences and the influences. Mrs. Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley was of so fine a nature that she could well afford to busy herself in any possible household chore. No dust nor grime could stick to the pure silver. Editor's note. Mrs. Ripley died in Concord in the summer of 1867. Mr. Emerson had known and prized her from the time of her marriage to his kind and helpful half-uncle, Samuel Ripley, in whose school at Waltham, of which she was a great part, he had as a boy studied and given some small help. Reverend Mr. Ripley, after his retirement, moved back to his birthplace, the Old Manse in Concord, but died very soon. Mrs. Ripley lived there with her daughters until her death more than 20 years later, and she and her brother, George P. Bradford, were constant and welcome visitors to Mr. and Mrs. Emerson at their home. Mr. Emerson wrote of her, At a time when perhaps no other woman read Greek, she acquired the language with ease and read Plato, adding soon the advantage of German commentators. After her marriage, when her husband, the well-known clergyman of Waltham, received boys in his house to be fitted for college, she assumed the advanced instruction in Greek and Latin, and did not fail to turn it into account by extending her studies in the literature of both languages. She became one of the best Greek scholars in the country, and continued in her latest years of the habit of reading Homer, the tragedians, and Plato. But her studies took a wide range in mathematics, in natural philosophy, in psychology, and theology, as well as in ancient and modern literature. She had always a keen ear, open to whatever new facts astronomy, chemistry, or the theories of light and heat had to furnish. Any knowledge, all knowledge, was welcome. Her stores increased day by day. She was absolutely without pedantry. Nobody ever heard of her learning until a necessity came for its use. And then nothing could be more simple than her solution of the problem proposed to her. The most intellectual gladly conversed with one whose knowledge, however rich and varied, was always with her only the means of new acquaintance. She was not only the most amiable, but the tenderest of women, wholly sincere, thoughtful for others. She was absolutely without appetite for luxury or display or praise or influence, with entire indifference to trifles. Charles Newcomb has wonderful power of illustration of his refinements of sentiment by means of household experiences, such as the youth sleeping with his brother feels how much he is not to him. Bacon at home in his reflections, when intellectual then he is himself, as a childless woman, restless except when making bread, and is then happy in singing. Original power in men is usually accompanied with assimilating power. Read Parsons' Dante. The translation appears excellent, most faithful, yet flowing and elegant with remarkable felicities, as when, and then of course there's a quotation untranslated, is rendered, oh, here it is translated now, through all the dingy circles down in hell. But Dante still appears to me, as ever, an exceptional mind, a prodigy of imaginative function, executive rather than contemplative or wise. Undeniable force of a peculiar kind, a prodigy, but not like Shakespeare or Socrates or Goethe, a beneficent humanity. His fames and infamies are so capriciously distributed. What odd reasons for putting his men in Inferno! The somnambulic genius of Dante is dream strengthened to the 10th power, dream so fierce that it grasps all the details of the phantom spectacle, and in spite of itself clutches and conveys them into the waking memory, and can recite what every other would forget. What pitiless minuteness of horrible details! He is a curiosity, like the mastodon, but one would not desire such for friends and contemporaries, abnormal throughout, like Swedenborg. But at a frightful cost these obtain their fame. Dante a man to put in a museum, but not in your house. Indeed, I never read him, nor regret that I do not. And then a footnote states, this is a characteristic expression of Mr. Emerson's aversion of the negative and dismal. Of course, this refers to the Inferno alone. Quote, and two I saw there leaning back to back, propped like a pair of dishes, put to warm. End quote. Dante says, living I am, and thou, if craving fame, mayst count it precious, this was my reply, that I with other notes record thy name. Parsons' translation, Inferno, Canto 32. For 'tis no task wherewith to be amused, the bottom of the universe to paint. Quotation and originality. Subsequent to printing. Leibniz predicted the zoophytes, Phenoon, Kant the asteroids, Swedenborg Uranus, Goethe found the true theory of colors, Kenelm Digby the same theory in 1580, Columbus nor Cabot not the first discoverer of America, Linnaeus did not find the sexes in plants so soon as Van Helmont by 100 years. Will not an age or a man come when it will be thought impertinent to say of him as soon as he is dead, "Poor Mr. A or B or C"? There is no saying of Rochefoucauld which is so bitter a satire on humanity as our religious Dr. Johnson's, when someone lamented the death of a friend. We must either outlive our friends, you know, or our friends must outlive us, and I see no man who would hesitate about the choice. Johnson, with his force of thought and skill of expression, with his large learning and his true manliness, with his piety and his obstinate narrow prejudices, and with all his rude impulses, is the ideal or representative Englishman. Note also the sharp limitations of his thought. I never can read a page of Piazzi without being reminded of Aunt Mary. September 1st. Struggled hard last night in a dream to repeat and save a thought or a sentence broken in the dream, but it eluded me at last, only came out of the pulling with this rag. His the deeper problem, but mine the better ciphered. Editor's note. In September, Mr. Emerson read "The Preacher" to a company assembled at the house of Reverend J.T. Sargent in Boston. End note. Buckminster, Channing, Everett, Taylor, Beecher, Bushnell, Chapin. It is they who are necessary, and the opinions of the floating crowd of no importance whatever. A vivid thought brings the power to paint it, and in proportion to the depth of its source is the force of its projection. I am happy and enriched. I go away invigorated, assisted in my own work, however different from his, and shall not forget to come again for new impulses. At the present day, thoughtful people must be struck with the fact that the old religious forms are outgrown, as shown by the fact that every intellectual man is out of the old church. All the young men of intelligence are on what is called the radical side. How long will the people continue to exclude these and invite the dull men? Beecher told me that he did not hold one of the 5 points of Calvinism in a way to satisfy his father. The good heaven is sending every hour good minds into the world, and all of them at maturity, on opening, discover the same expansion, the impatience of the old cramps, and a bias to the new interpretation. If you hold them in the old used-up air, they suffocate. Would you in New Massachusetts have an old Spain? The laws of nature are simple to poverty, but their applications immense and innumerable. I wish to find in my preacher that power to illuminate and warm and purify, which I know in the fiery souls which have cheered and lifted my life, and if possible, that power to clothe every secret and abstract thought in its corresponding material symbol. Seas and mountains, timber and metals, diamonds and fossils interest the eye, but it is only with some preparatory or predicting charm. Their real value comes only when I hear their meaning made plain in the spiritual truth they cover. In that Newtonian experiment we wrote of above, there is the surprise and delight of finding identity, which the deep mind always anticipates. The child is perpetually amused by a new object, by a chip or a wad of wool or a rope or a bed key. Each of 100 subjects, if before unseen, amuses him for a few moments, and he is long in learning, as the man is long in learning, that each is the old toy in a new mask. Naturel. M.S. said on hearing the parts at commencement that she did not care so much for the improvement the speakers showed as for how much of the boys they had kept. The beauty of the landscape is in proportion to the quantity of light, from tragic to celestial. Butler told Fox he had never read Smith's Wealth of Nations. "Neither have I," replied Fox. "There is something in all these subjects which passes my comprehension, something so wide that I could never embrace them myself, or find anyone who did." Peace to the strephant horn. Neither can I comprehend the west wind, but I open my hay when it blows, or lift the anchor and go to sea, because I know it is the right wind for fair weather. Another example of Sterling's zymosis is the dramatic, then there's an untranslated Greek word, in Elizabethan age, and the metaphysical in Germany in the 19th century. September. Ralph looks as if he was afraid that all these beautiful things would vanish before he had time to see them. And now for my faggots of letters. It occurs that in my doctrines of classes it cannot be forgotten how each passes to every person under different categories. In Boston I pass for a scholar, but to my friend Ross only in connection with the cows, and my name is Moo. October 31st. William Forbes says that little Ralph puts on his society face when he sees his newborn sister in the cradle and gives her a condescending kiss. The God of victory is said to be one-handed, but peace gives victory to both sides. Style. Matthew Arnold has the true critical perception and feeling of style, and has shown more insight on that subject than any contemporary. See his Celts and his Homer. Earl Grey said in the old Reform discussion in 1832, when questioned by the Tories how far he should carry his principle if the Reformers should pull down the House of Lords, etc., "I shall stand by my order." Carlyle and his followers now stand as the Tories did, and in their zeal to stand by the aristocratic order, one wishes to ask them, "But if your order stands for injustice, do you not belong to a higher order?" Carlyle might well be allowed to the liberty of genius of riding his hobby very hard, of riding into the inferno, if he will, sure that he has the palm branch of poets in his hand, and the power of genius will bring him safely back. But under the attraction and prestige of his name, Tennyson and Ruskin and Kingsley, men of talent but far inferior to him in character, venture to follow their party or society proclivities also, and subscribe to the infamous Eyre Fund. This is a grave misfortune to themselves and to their society which follows them. The like wrongs are found here, and our society needs a crusade preached by our Peter Hermits. Holmes, in his lecture to the Medical College, said that Dr. James Jackson's preface to his Letters to a Young Physician compared well with three famous prefaces, namely Calvin's to his Institutes, Casaubon's to Polybius, and President Duthal's to his History. 'Tis very certain that when the deluge comes in, it will not mind our garden fences, nor Boston or Portland, nor New York, but only the Alleghanies and the Andes, or the lines where the pent-up fires are hottest and the crust of the globe thinnest. Mr. Grattan, English consul, said at the Dickens dinner in Boston that the chairman's four vices were as good as the four cardinal virtues of any other man. Holmes, Hillard, Ellis Gray Loring, and T.J. Stevenson were the vice presidents. I rarely take down Horace or Martial at home, but when reading in the Athenaeum or Union Club, if I come upon a quotation from either, I resolve on the instant to read them every day. But, at home again, homely thoughts. Quotation. Yes, but how differently persons quote. I am as much informed of your genius by what you select as by what you originate. I read the quotation with your eyes and find a new and fervent sense. Thus Shakespeare's Richard II has always borrowed much of its interest from Edmund Kean's rendering, though I had that play only at second hand from him through William Emerson, who heard him in London. When I saw Kean in Boston, he played nothing so high. The reading of books is according to the sensibility of the scholar. One remembers his friends by their favorite poetry or other reading, as I recall Shakespeare's "Make mouths at the invisible event," always from Aunt Mary's lips, and so many of Antoninus's and Milton's sentences. The synthesis, the architecture, gives the value to all the stones. A thought contents me, but has little value to any other to whom I speak it. But as soon as greater mental activity or more scope places that thought with its right foregoers and followers, and we have a right discourse, we have somewhat impressive and powerful, and the worth of the solitary thought vastly enhanced. Certain resemblances in nature, or unexpected repetitions of form, give keen pleasure when observed, as the figure of the oak leaf on the under shell of the tortoise, the figure of the acanthus leaf in the flame of burning wood, or, better, as Ellery Channing said, that the oak wood burning gives again the form of the oak leaf. So the vegetable form of frost on the window pane suggesting the identity of vegetation with crystallization, so the piping of the hylas in the early days of April sounds at a little distance like the jingle of sleigh bells. And Quatremere de Quincey's theory of art is resemblance in the work to something of a different kind. And why not in the repetition and nature of her sense, as of the orange and the little false johnswort, of black birch and checkerberry? In this old matter of originality and quotation, a few points to be made distinctly. The apparently immense amount of debt to the old, at first view 'tis all quotation, all we have, but presently we make distinction, first by wise quotation. Vast differences in the first mode of quotation. One quotes so well that the person quoted is a gainer. The quoter's selection honors and celebrates the author. The quoter gives more fame than he receives aid. Thus Coleridge. Quoting is often merely a suggestion which the quoter drew but of which the author is quite innocent. For good quoting, then, there must be originality in the quoter, bent, bias, delight in the truth, and only valuing the author in the measure of his agreement with the truth which we see and which he had the luck to see first. If another's words describe your fact, use them as freely as you use the language in the alphabet, whose use does not impair your originality. Neither will another's sentiment or distinction impugn your sufficiency. Yet in proportion to your reality of life and perceptions will be your difficulty of finding yourself expressed in others' words or deeds. And yet, I hesitate to denounce reading as aught inferior or mean. When visions of my books come over me as I sit writing, when the remembrance of some poet comes, I accept it with pure joy, and quit my thinking as sad lumbering work, and hasten to my little heaven, if it is then accessible as angels might. For these social affections also are part of nature and being, and the delight in another's superiority is, as Aunt Mary said, my best gift from God. For here the moral nature is involved, which is higher than the intellectual. The new knowledge is nothing but the old knowledge, new vamped and painted. The illusion of knowing, Aunt Mary. December. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson records the following guests from overseas who visited him during the autumn. End note. September 11th, Mr. H. Lee Warner of St. John's College, Cambridge, England. October, Viscount and Lady Amberley. November 23rd, Mr. Cowper, Earl Morley, and Lord Camperdown, with letter from Froude. Honorable Mr. Stratt and Mr. J.R. Holland, with letter from Mrs. Ward. Reverend Leslie Stephen and his wife, who is Thackeray's daughter. Editor's note. Notwithstanding the first 2 months of the year having been spent in the West, lecturing, Mr. Emerson's calls carried him again thither in the last month. Beginning in Erie, Pennsylvania, on the 5th, before the new year came in, he had spoken in Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, and Missouri. He fulfilled his engagements at all sacrifice of comfort and even at serious risk, as this extract from a letter written to his family shows. December 17th. Yesterday morning, in bitter cold weather, I had the pleasure of crossing the Mississippi in a skiff with Mr. Blank. We the sole passengers, and a man and a boy for oarsmen. I have no doubt they did their work better than the Harvard 6 could have done it, as much of the rowing was on the surface of fixed ice, in fault of running water. But we arrived without other accident than becoming almost fixed ice ourselves. But the long run to the Tepfer house, the volunteered rubbing of our hands by the landlord and clerks, and good fire restored us. Footnote. It should be remembered that Mr. Emerson was 64 years old. This is the end of Journal Collection number 58, dating from the year 1867, when the author was 64 years old. Thank you for listening.